we've taken up this question of consciousness experientially in the past. We've said, observing without the observer, consciousness remains aware of itself. And this awareness of itself doesn't take place through a reflective process, such that consciousness is not necessarily aware of itself by thinking about itself. But rather, simply in being conscious, consciousness is self-conscious. What I want to extract from this discussion at the moment is that consciousness is a limited, temporary, somatic system, a particular way of knowing and being that exists over and above the activity of the senses. Although while consciousness is present, it's intertwined with them, such that the two can never be separated. If consciousness is totally conscious of itself, that very consciousness brings it to an end. What consciousness cannot understand in terms of its existing knowledge, because all of its existing knowledge exists in relationship to its particular prioritization. So when that particular prioritization is emptied out, is rendered irrelevant by increasingly comprehensive forms of knowledge of itself, in place of the old egoic center is a void, an empty center. All consciousness knows of it is that it can't understand it in terms of its own knowledge. And then if consciousness penetrates into that center, either moving into it consciously, and so restructuring its content over time, you follow? Being aware of the unknown, and so making it part of the known, gradually, restructuring itself, consciousness comes upon a new ground. A ground which does not prioritize itself particularly. It comes upon a knowledge of itself which is a distinction which does not imply separation, but to the contrary, a state of union. So we've come to continue our inquiry into the nature of death. And last time we discussed fairly thoroughly the reality of death, which is
fairly thoroughly
the death that is able to be considered by consciousness. And as well as the reality of death, there's also the actuality of death, such that emptying out the content of our consciousness culminates and terminates in the permanent cessation of that very consciousness. So today I think we should talk over the question, what is consciousness and what is death? Consciousness is a very peculiar mechanical form of intelligence. In that, in the very essential mechanism of consciousness, consciousness is sensitive to the fact of its own existence. Consciousness is sensitive to its own being, its own life. And so in this way, consciousness has an inherent self-reflexivity, such that consciousness has a necessary experience of itself. An experience of itself in the form of knowledge of its own being, existence, and life. Consciousness is sensitive to its own existence, and this sensitivity to its own existence is what is fueling the essential activity of consciousness, such that Consciousness is producing its own energy.
Which is like the expression of that energy would be like a flex, like in the muscle, in the brain, and so reflexes for that expression of energy to be repeated. Unto itself.
Reflex means simple pattern, stimulus and response, which doesn't demand intention, doesn't demand thought, doesn't demand deliberation of any kind.
Like there's energy and then there's energy again. That's like, I'm trying to use very simple words.
But just in the very operation of a given mechanism, this happens, so this happens.
Like happening again.
Wherever there's the stimulus, there's the response. But consciousness is not responding to something external to itself. Essentially, what consciousness is responding to is the fact of its own existence. In this way, consciousness is self-reflexive.
One has a sense of self, and this sense of self has a sense of being, a sense of living, a sense of existing. And you're saying that the activity of this self is a response to this sense.
I would almost put it the other way around. Is that this experience that consciousness has of itself is a response to its own mechanism. It is a product of its own mechanism. I don't know if my discussion is too technical, but like there's the actuality of consciousness and then there's the experience of consciousness. The knowledge that consciousness has of itself. But consciousness's experience of itself does not exhaust its actuality, such that consciousness is not totally transparent to itself. Consciousness is sensitive to its own existence, peculiarly sensitive to its own existence. And so being peculiarly sensitive to its own existence, consciousness makes a distinction between itself and all other things. And making this distinction within itself, identifying this distinction, it has knowledge of it. And so being sensitive to its own existence, peculiarly, making it distinct, consciousness has knowledge of its own existence, which is an experience, generally unconscious, unrecognized. The same with its being, its life. This is why I say I don't know if the discussion is too technical.
I don't know how to move from...
I'm giving an account of the basic mechanism.
There's a fly in my ear, if you will. There's a quality of technical mumbo-jumbo. I don't know how to...
We can approach this question experientially, but the experiential account will not be an adequate response to this question. We've taken up this question of consciousness experientially in the past. We've said observing without the observer, consciousness remains aware of itself. And this awareness of itself doesn't take place through a reflective process, such that consciousness is not necessarily aware of itself by thinking about itself. But rather, simply in being conscious, consciousness is self-conscious. Conscious of its own being, conscious of its own life, conscious of its own existence.
Right, which is not a product of thought.
These experiences generally take place unconsciously, unrecognized, because they're so familiar.
Yep.
So simple. And so in this way, consciousness can have partial experience of its own nature, structure, functioning. Naturally, it does.
It can have what?
Partial experience of its own nature.
Which is like its partial knowledge of its own structure and nature.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm giving an account, mechanistic account, of how it is that consciousness actually works. Thought also is a mechanical form of intelligence. But the intelligence of thought is not intrinsically aware of itself. The object of thought, what thought is measuring, what thought is sensitive to, is not necessarily itself. Thought may become aware of itself. But only under certain conditions. But the mechanism of consciousness is such that intrinsically it's sensitive to its own existence. And so being sensitive to itself, in a way in which it is not sensitive to other things, consciousness distinguishes itself. And identifying this distinction over time gains knowledge of itself. So consciousness has necessary self-knowledge.
Sir, I've tried very hard to listen to what you're saying, and I don't know what you're saying. I'm trying to relate to what you're saying the way I've related to what other people have said before, and it's not working. I don't understand the line of thought. I don't understand the words being used. It seems like you have a special sense for that. I understand that you're using words in the common English language, like reflex, consciousness, experience. But the arrangement by which they're being presented, I don't understand. I also don't know how I will understand. It seems rather complicated, technical, unapproachable.
You know, sir, I think the problem here is not the words. I think the words are rather simple.
Mm-hmm.
The account itself, although technical, I think is rather simple.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue here, I think, is deeper, such that what is being said here can never be fully understood by consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness may understand itself to a certain extent. Consciousness may explore itself to a certain extent. But consciousness is a temporary, finite, somatic function that has a continued existence which is dependent on knowledge. Because consciousness is sensitive to its own existence, in a peculiar way in which it is not sensitive to other things, it distinguishes itself. And so identifying this distinction over time is able to have knowledge of itself. So while consciousness continues to exist, it must have a necessary knowledge of itself. The greater consciousness's self-knowledge means the more, as a limited function, consciousness has a limited capacity for knowledge. And consciousness's essential knowledge is self-knowledge. So, as consciousness gains self-knowledge, it's exhausting its capacity to know about itself.
I see. Like it's exercising to its limit. It's like it's getting to know the things that it could know about itself. And you're saying knowledge as a limited function naturally has an end. And so hence the word exhaustion. I see.
Where consciousness has continuity, it will have an unrealized potential for self-knowledge.
Where consciousness has a
continued existence, it has an unrealized potential for self-knowledge. It has a capacity for self-knowledge it has not yet realized. If consciousness were to become totally aware of itself, totally conscious of itself, in that very moment, consciousness comes to an end.
I see. And with it does itself the forming of self-knowledge also come to an end?
What I want to extract from this discussion at the moment is that consciousness is a limited, temporary, somatic system, a particular way of knowing and being that exists over and above the activity of the senses. Consciousness is not merely sentience. Consciousness is not merely the presence of sensory activity. Consciousness is a peculiar form of mechanical intelligence that is sensitive to its own existence, which is implied in the fact that consciousness is necessarily aware of itself.
And so the table is not conscious, although it responds dynamically. Well, I'd be hard-pressed to describe the activity of the table as responding or dynamic.
Dynamic.
Yeah, it's not right. The physicists and biologists are like, that's not right.
Have I made this more or less clear?
Consciousness as a limited somatic mechanism, which operates over and above the activity of the senses.
Although while consciousness is present, it's intertwined with them, such that the two can never be separated.
I see, and we're asking, are we happy with the way we've put it? More or less. I see, and then your additional qualifier was, if I may call it that, I'm sorry. Your additional qualifier was, but while consciousness is present,
the activity of consciousness in the senses can't be separated.
I see.
The activity of senses limits the activity of consciousness, and consciousness limits the activity of the senses. One senses what one is conscious of, and one is conscious of what one senses.
I see, but you're saying that with the ending of consciousness, there would be a recognition of, oh, I can't quite use that word. So when I'm asking you these questions, am I pursuing a sense that I understand what you've said? That we're sharing the same language?
Part of the difficulty may be, I may be incorrect, may be a wish to contextualize the discussion, to see the various implications and significance of what's being said. Because generally this is the structure of our dialogue, step by step. But I think in the context of this discussion, it's not possible to appreciate the significance, to contextualize the thing until we go through it. Such that I've tried to provide here a basic account of the structure of consciousness. And I want to go on to discuss the working of consciousness, the capacities of consciousness, the significance of emptying consciousness, the ways to empty consciousness, and also the cessation itself, the ending. And I think only with consideration of this whole field can any part of it be fully appreciated.
I see. So in the meantime, it might serve us well for me to simply listen. And
there must
perhaps
be
check once in a while, respond with the...
There must be at least an intellectual understanding so that we can move forward, so that we can build on what's been said already.
I have to exercise my capacity to at least follow along with the current. And I think hence the simplifying phrases, like, is it the case that consciousness is a limited... You see, not knowing what's being said, I simply want to begin with, at least, if I want to understand what you're saying, I want to begin with at least what you are offering. And so, it's not particularly important for me to... I'm not trying to memorize what you're saying. I think they say in a musical piece, there's like the overture, the melodic theme. There's the consciousness as a limited somatic mechanism which operates over and above the activities of the senses. And you're saying, while consciousness is present, the mechanism of consciousness and the activity of the senses are intertwined. Okay.
And that the mechanism of consciousness is peculiar in that it is intrinsically sensitive to its own existence. And so has a necessary experience of itself.
Right, and this was the self-reflexivity. And not knowing what's being said, if I want to follow along, I need to have something, a little bit. Otherwise, I just don't listen and ponder on my own whatever I wish to ponder, if there's any ponderance at all.
So, because consciousness distinguishes itself and is sensitive to this distinction over time, from this sensitivity comes knowledge.
Because consciousness is sensitive to itself, and this sensitivity exists over time. From this over time knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Such that each moment in consciousness
Mm-hmm.
is minimally accounted for by some change in consciousness's self-knowledge. Some change in its sensitivity of itself. Sensitive to itself in a slightly different way, in relationship to slightly different contents.
Could you say once more?
Now here I'm trying to describe the relationship of consciousness to time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Consciousness has an essential knowledge of itself. This is the basic ingredient within its experience, such that all of consciousness's other experiences are related to its basic essential experiences of itself, its basic knowledge of itself. Consciousness's experience, consciousness's knowledge is ordered in relationship to consciousness's knowledge of itself. Everything that consciousness is sensitive to is understood in terms of consciousness's sensitivity to itself.
I see, which is its essential knowledge. I see, you're saying...
From which it has essential knowledge.
I see. You're saying it's so essential that its very notion of knowledge is a product of the essence. Okay, so you're saying... consciousness has a center which orders the information that it comes across.
Around which everything is arranged.
Okay. And you're saying also that the center has a relationship to time.
Mm-hmm.
And the things being ordered around the center also necessarily has a relationship to time.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the ordering.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Time means awareness of change. Consciousness's basic awareness is awareness of itself. So that all of consciousness's awareness of change is understood in terms of consciousness's awareness of change within itself.
Could you go once more?
To be aware of time is to be aware of change.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness is necessarily, basically, essentially aware of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So any awareness consciousness has of change is ultimately an awareness of consciousness's change of itself.
Mm-hmm. With respect to its center. Okay.
With respect to its self-sensitivity.
I see, which may or may not be its center.
Which is responsible for its center.
I see. I don't want to...
which is producing its center.
Like center attributes of knowledge. I see. The trip is like essential knowledge could be the center, or this is what it thinks of its essence, what it thinks of as its essence is the same thing as essential knowledge.
The center of consciousness within its experience is its knowledge of itself. Its knowledge of itself is the result and is fueling consciousness's sensitivity to itself. Consciousness represents itself to itself. Consciousness experiences itself in terms of itself.
Is consciousness's self-sensitivity different from its self-reflexivity?
Perhaps you could say the self-reflexivity is the outcome of its self-sensitivity?
Oh, I was wondering if I would say it the other way around.
The other way around?
Yeah. I sense myself as a reflex.
When I describe consciousness as being sensitive to itself, I'm not describing an experience.
Okay.
I'm providing an account of the reflexive mechanism. We can discuss consciousness in two ways. We can discuss the experience of consciousness, and we can also discuss it mechanistically, looking, as it were, at the other side of the coin.
Like watching its steps, and then laying it out in like the most simple terms available.
As simple as I can manage, yes.
But if one doesn't have access to these terms from the get-go, let's say, rather difficult to follow.
I think to understand this conversation to any degree whatsoever, consciousness must have gone into the question of its own nature and structure.
You're saying like the observation is necessary?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, technical mumbo jumbo.
Yes.
Yes.
For sure.
Okay.
If consciousness has become aware of the fact that it is self-conscious, if it recognizes this consciously, if it becomes aware of its own essential content, then one has certain reference with which one can use to make sense of this discussion, at least partially. One has a certain context, certain knowledge that is relevant to the discussion at hand.
Yeah. Otherwise, you turn the TV off.
Perhaps I've constructed this discussion in a narrative sense poorly. We started today, we said we want to talk about the end of consciousness.
I see.
And I thought to understand the end of consciousness, the significance of it, one also has to understand consciousness. But
it's the whole mechanism of it.
The fact that we shall come to in time, and I have referred to briefly, the fact of the matter is that consciousness is unable to have a full understanding of itself. Consciousness can only be understood in its absence. Because consciousness cannot have a complete knowledge of itself.
Right, like while it's present, the sensory activities are confusing.
Not the sensory activities, but a limitation in consciousness's own way of knowing. Because consciousness is peculiarly sensitive to itself, in this sensitivity to itself makes a distinction of itself and has necessary knowledge of this distinction in the continuation of its own activity. Consciousness is a way of knowing that is essentially conditioned by knowledge. So all of consciousness's operation, understanding, exists in relationship in terms of knowledge. And consciousness is unable to have a complete knowledge of itself. So consciousness's understanding of itself is always incomplete. Consciousness is always only conscious of itself partially. If consciousness is totally conscious of itself, that very consciousness brings it to an end. Interesting question about whether such a thing is possible or not. But I wanted to construct this discussion, again, perhaps perhaps in misguided spirits, to address the thing as it were from beginning to end.
Like moving forward.
Yes.
But in fact, you're also pointing out simultaneously in this direction. You're pointing out the necessity of the backwards movement.
I'm trying to describe now the relationship of consciousness to time. Consciousness is aware of itself, is responding to itself in time. Self-reflexive mechanism takes time to operate.
It's mechanism.
So consciousness is temporally extended. We may make further divisions within the temporal structure of consciousness.
Such as?
The psychological movement of thought as a division between past, present, and future.
I see.
So there is that psychological movement of time.
I see.
And then also, there is physical movement of time that consciousness is participating in. So,
physical movement of time is
the material,
the gathering and the collision, explosion.
Perhaps now again this point is overly technical to make and not all that relevant. When there's no continuity of psychological time, consciousness experiences everything as now. Consciousness has an experience of timeless now, such that the now contains the past, the present, and the future. This, I think, is fairly simple. What I'm trying to say now is that each moment in consciousness, although it may be experienced as timeless, actually involves a certain elapsation of a period of time.
Because it's an experience.
Although that moment of time is experienced indivisibly, it has a structure.
It's like,
and it has a relationship to the previous moment and also the future moment in time, which is not put together by thought, essentially.
Yeah. Like one sees the past catching up to the present.
So I'm trying to provide an account of consciousness's temporal structure because consciousness is, by nature, temporally extended.
The unseen relevance which existed in the past is like felt now, or in the present, and then its significance is seen in the future, or its significance is seen, which is its future.
So I'm saying each moment in consciousness is a response to the previous moment in consciousness. And those moments are distinguished by a distinction in consciousness's self-knowledge.
Those distinctions are?
Those moments are distinguished by a distinction in consciousness's self-knowledge.
I see.
And so in this way, consciousness has a temporally extended structure, each moment in consciousness responding to the previous moment in consciousness, because consciousness has been sensitized to itself in a way that it can distinguish from the previous moment.
So this would be the distinctions in its self-knowledge. Part of consciousness, not part of consciousness, but still part of self-consciousness, self-knowledge.
So what I'm trying to put forward in this discussion is that consciousness has an essential capacity for distinction, and that capacity for distinction takes place in time. Because if we have more or less understanding of this, we can go on to discuss one of the most remarkable features in consciousness, which is consciousness's ability to have knowledge of things that don't change in time. Consciousness's ability to have knowledge of beauty. Consciousness's ability to have knowledge of goodness. Not knowledge of a beautiful thing, not knowledge of a good action, but knowledge of beauty, knowledge of goodness. Knowledge not of something meaningful, but knowledge of meaning. Because in this necessary capacity for distinction, if there is a certain development in consciousness, a certain maturation in consciousness, which is in various ways what we've been exploring in our previous discussions, in this capacity for distinction, in maturing this capacity for distinction, consciousness has an ability to distinguish in time what doesn't change in that very same movement of time. You follow? There is a change in...
It's illegal for you to ask me if I follow. It's breaking the law.
Consciousness detects a change within itself, but doesn't detect a change within that thing. Distinguishing in time and not finding change within the object of knowledge. In a sense, we could say that consciousness is gaining a capacity to the word abstract has a poor connotation outside of a philosophical attitude, such that abstraction generally involves the notion of derivation, such that abstract entities are derived from particular entities. This is the ordinary connotation of that term. But philosophically speaking, it may not be necessary to use abstract in this sense. And so, speaking cautiously with the philosophical language for a moment, we can say that consciousness is gaining the capacity to abstract forms of knowledge, forms of content that are unchanging in time. Such that there is a movement of distinction within time, and in that movement, abstracting from that movement content which does not change throughout that movement. And so gaining a capacity for more abstract, which is not to say derivative, but rather comprehensive, more comprehensive forms of knowledge. Abstract in the sense that they are not limited to the particular situation. Abstraction implies that an abstraction is relevant across many particular situations. But generally we use that word abstract to mean from set of particular situations, we abstract general situation. But the general content may be much more actual.
You're saying it's closer to the ground.
And so in this one abstracts beauty. That quality which is essential across all beautiful experiences.
I see. Which isn't beauty as it exists in general, but
and so
it's not a beauty which exists ideally.
No. That which is neither the particular nor the general may be called the universal.
Oh, I see. Fascinating. Such that our particular experiences of beauty are actually in themselves abstractions, in the colloquial sense. It's actually our experiences of beauty which are less real than me. These are more actual, less blasphemy in philosophy. Like you've opened the doors to infinite regress as more and more actual.
Oh, yeah. Oh. No.
higher and higher levels, or lower and lower, deeper and deeper levels. Sir, but what are we saying? What are we saying?
I'm saying consciousness has a capacity for...
We began as consciousness as a limited somatic mechanism.
Yes, sir.
Which operates over and above the sensory activity.
Yes, sir.
And we're saying that a remarkable thing about consciousness is that although its knowledge is formed in time, somehow
not really somehow. Some account has been provided. Yes. But
it will be somehow.
Somehow.
It will be somehow.
Yes, somehow.
That is how the ear will hear it.
Yes, sir.
There exists knowledge of timeless qualities.
Yes. Things which do not change in that very time in which the knowledge is being formed.
Okay.
Knowledge means distinction. Consciousness first and foremost makes itself distinct, and then also there are various other forms of distinction. Danger, toxicity, nourishment, sex. Various forms of distinction, various forms of knowledge, which are common, both in human beings and also in the animal world. But because consciousness has a necessary self-knowledge, ordinarily, distinctions are distinctions of content that is changing in time. Because the formation of knowledge itself takes time. So only the content that is itself changing is relevant to the formation of that knowledge.
Typically.
But because consciousness has an intrinsic sensitivity to itself, because consciousness necessarily makes itself distinct in time, consciousness has an opportunity in relationship to that continuity within its own distinction, and also the change within the forms of its own distinction, to identify content that is not changing through that process of knowledge formation. And so consciousness can have knowledge not only of the particular, not only of the general, but also of the universal.
I see, such that the distinctions made in time make distinct the experiences, but not the quality. Like the beautiful experience I had then is different from the beautiful experience I had today. And I may even say the beauty then is different from the beauty today. But removing the distinctions made in time, there's beauty.
in distinction from the things that are changing, one can distinguish the things that are not changing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. And then there's also been business of identifying with the limits of the not changing. There's speak of like eternal self, eternal. Mm-hmm. But potentially this misstep.
Yes, sir.
It's
a form of confusion.
It's not quite right. Yes.
Because
we're taking what we have known, coming across what we don't know at all, but from the fact of our contact with it, applying what is known to what is unknown, and then making it known.
There is a confusion between the knowledge and the actuality. Mm-hmm. Because consciousness is its content. Mm-hmm. Consciousness is its own experience, and also what is experienced. Mm-hmm. So if consciousness experiences something not conditioned by time, the fact is, it is its experience of that. But being its experience of that and not understanding its own limitations, consciousness might think it is that.
Mm-hmm. Or say, like, because I'm conditioned by time, like I can't experience anything outside of time. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, beauty conditioned by time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It gets a little bit stranger, I'm afraid. Mm-hmm. I say it gets a little bit stranger, I'm afraid. Consciousness is really a highly peculiar thing.
So what have we said?
Consciousness is sensitive to its own existence. Mm-hmm. Being sensitive to its own existence, it makes itself distinct, and so has a necessary self-knowledge. And that necessary self-knowledge provides a background, a condition, a context against which, in relationship to which, there can be a distinction of content that is not changing in time. Having a relationship to time, being structured by time, by its very nature, against that, there can be measurement. There is a standard of measurement against which to distinguish what is not changing.
Are you saying that coming across the limitations of consciousness, one can consider both sides of the fence? If I draw a line, and I understand my points, I understand my limits up to this point. Now I have the other side of the line.
Understanding this side of the fence allows me to know there's another side of the fence. Mm-hmm.
The moment I draw a circle, there's an inside of the circle and outside of the circle.
May we carry on?
You're asking me?
In consciousness's increasing capacity for abstraction, used in the sense we discussed earlier, consciousness has the capacity to abstract not only particulars, but also universals.
Beyond the generals.
We've said that consciousness has an experience of its own being, its own existence, and its own life. Originally, in its default condition, in its egoic condition, consciousness has knowledge of these things particularly. It has a particular knowledge of its own existence, a particular knowledge of its own life, and a particular knowledge of its own being. Such that it encounters itself as other than everything else. But in developing its capacity for knowledge, consciousness can also come to recognize not the quality of this existence and that existence, this being and that being, this life and that life, but can come to recognize the qualities of being, the qualities of existence, and the quality of life. Not the existence of this or that, but just the quality of existence.
Like universally.
Yes. That universal
use that
quality of existence, which can be recognized in all existing things.
Like it loses its narrowness.
And so with this, consciousness's knowledge of itself is expanding.
Oh, I see. Even at this step, it's an expansion. I see. Perhaps
Because
like in the direction of global perspectivism we spoke about earlier.
Because consciousness has knowledge of being as such within the knowledge of its own being.
I see.
So the particular is contextualized within the context of the universal.
Oh, I thought the universal
is contextualized is perhaps a better way of putting it.
I see. So we're merely at the general stage, if I may. If something is contextualized by particular senses, it seems like this is the general sense of life, the general sense of being.
Yes, I think this is quite right. Apparently universal, but not quite.
Yeah, it has the tinge of concern that I had about global perspective.
No, I think
I
think you're quite right.
Merely at a generalism.
I think you're quite right. Like,
it's not quite universal, just yet.
That quality of existence can be recognized in all existing things, but the particular has the priority.
It's contextualized by the particular.
By the particulars. Yes, I think that's right. But
what are we saying? Dear Lord.
This knowledge of the general, contextualized by the particular,
yes,
affects a change in the particular knowledge.
Yes.
Such
naturally.
The particular knowledge that was not contextualizing the general knowledge is being negated.
Come again. The particular knowledge that isn't contextualized. I see. Like
consciousness's old egoic knowledge of itself, old separative knowledge of itself.
I see, because it's seeing the general.
Because it's seeing the general.
So it's eliminating that narrowness.
The particular is being seen in relationship to the general. So yes, that narrowness is being emptied out.
I see. So at first, the priority is given to the particular necessarily because the general is abstracted from the particulars. But over time, because the general is more actual, if I may.
More comprehensive.
More comprehensive. Yes. More comprehensive. It has a more
contentful.
What was the word?
I think more actual is not bad, actually. It sounds very peculiar, but
it has more power. I don't know. Anyway, and so over time, like this fact is seen, and so priorities shifts. Or I don't know if it's shifts.
Because the new form of knowledge is more comprehensive, more relevant.
I see.
And
in the particular sense, it shifts. In the particular sense, it shifts.
So the new knowledge is negating the old knowledge. Because the old knowledge is no longer relevant. And also the old knowledge is not commensurable with the new knowledge. The new knowledge replaces the old knowledge.
Like it's dead.
Yes. And so in this, there is an emptying out of the egoic center of consciousness, which is consciousness that is prioritizing its own particularity.
I see. And once the particularity goes, this may be speculation, once the particularity goes, it's no longer, what remains isn't quite general, because general would exist in relationship to the particular. What remains is potential, if I may, universal.
Yes.
This is, I don't know if we want to go quite far, but
what remains initially, consciousness doesn't know. What remains initially in place of consciousness's egoic center is a void. What consciousness cannot understand in terms of its existing knowledge, because all of its existing knowledge exists in relationship to its particular prioritization. So when that particular prioritization is emptied out, is rendered irrelevant by increasingly comprehensive forms of knowledge of itself, in place of the old egoic center is a void, an empty center. All consciousness knows of it is that it can't understand it in terms of its own knowledge. And then if consciousness penetrates into that center, either moving into it consciously, and so restructuring its content over time, you follow? Being aware of the unknown, and so making it part of the known, gradually, restructuring itself, consciousness comes upon a new ground. A ground which does not prioritize itself particularly. It comes upon a knowledge of itself which is a distinction which does not imply separation, but to the contrary, a state of union. Such that consciousness's knowledge of itself is now united with consciousness's knowledge of being, life, existence, universally. Which has the priority? The universality, because that's what's relevant, that's what's comprehensive.
I see. Not as a... I understand you stated those reasons after the fact, but not necessarily in that order, correct? Like the fact of its priority is not conditional.
Structurally, the mechanism of consciousness gives priority
I see.
to the knowledge that is most relevant to its own mode of knowing and being. Naturally. So in this, a remarkable thing has taken place within the mechanism of consciousness itself. Because consciousness is distinguishing its content in time, distinguishing its own essential knowledge in time, but in the very same mechanism, in the very same movement in which it is distinguishing itself in time, it is distinguishing the quality of being, of life and existence within its own mechanism. Not the quality of being, life and existence that is peculiar to its own mechanism, but the qualities of being, life, existence themselves. And so consciousness is functioning in relationship to something immeasurable.
Is it other than it? It's hard to say. Immeasurable is quite nice. Like something that has nothing to do with consciousness isn't quite right either.
In relationship to
something,
the own sacred ground of its own existence. And so in this way, consciousness restructures itself from an egoic condition of consciousness to a condition where it prioritizes its own particularity into a unitive condition, where distinction is increasingly understood not in terms of division, separation, but relationship. Relationship not only to the being of oneself, but to the being of others. Because that quality of being is found in both. And that quality of being is what has priority.
Like there's a unifying of the being of oneself and the being of others. The common thread is seen, if you will. I don't know.
So the unitive state of consciousness is a state of love and compassion.
And at this point, the particulars have lost their priority, but not their existence. So it's not quite the universal that has priority.
The relationship. The relationship has the priority.